Hi, my name is Helen Henry Anonike. I'm presenting on the topic perspective in psychology, which is shown on my slide in the screen. I'm going to do a little bit of adjustment here so it could fit into the screen to show my slide, okay? So I'm going to be presenting maximum of 20 minutes of my work. So which is as followed with my table of content, which is my next slide is introductions and to perspective of psychology, evaluation of key assumptions of identifying psychological perspective. I'll be diving down to evaluate the key theories relating to identifying psychological perspective. I'll analyze the similarities and the difference between the two perspective psychology. I'll also evaluate the application of two perspective psychology to contemporary issues in psychological. And then the next one will be my introduction. My chapter 1 contains the research which is a research explore of the human perspective, led by the theory like Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, focusing on the subject experience and self-actualization, which is the However, I'm going to dive into the behavioral aspect of B.F. Skinner and John Watson, which emphasize the behaviorable behavior, which is evaluate both the approach and the strengths of his and the strength and weakness of his work and the assumptions and similarities like the study, which is also examine the application to the contemporary issues like anxiety disorder. My conclusion will integrate the both perspective and the improvement of therapeutic intervention. Thank you. So the next one on my slide, it's my chapter 2, which is a literature review from the historical context. The behaviorist perspective, which was introduced by the John Watson in 1913 to his paperwork was a psychology as an object neutral scientist, which redefined the psychology to focus solely on observation and that of stimuli and response. This approach view the organisms as blank slate, which is the tabula rasa in code, with the behavior entirely which shape the environmental factors. That in 2001 for Ferguson, yeah. In contrast to this, the humanistic perspective emerged in 1950 to 1960s through the works of Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. Maslow criticized the behaviorisms and fraudulent psychodynamic for promoting a limit view of psychology that emphasizes determinism and the pathology. And then going to my humanism posit that is that individuals are active agents and capable of constructing their own realization and inherently motivate towards growth and self-actualization. So the key theory and evolutions in the behavioral perspective, which is a classical conditioning and operant conditioning. The behaviorist, I would say, was built upon two primary learning model, which is classical, demonstrating how involuntary behavior could be learned, okay, and which through the association of apparent conditioning in works like Science and Human Behavior in 1953. He argued that the majority of these human behaviors is apparent, which is voluntary and shaped by the consequences. The next on my slide is a continuity, which is the criticisms and the cognitive challenges. Our primary critics is radical environmental determinism, which was dehumanizing, unable to account for phenomena like language and accusations, inside learning, and biological preparedness. That is 1959 in Chomsky, which is another one is a Bandura in 1970. Social learning theory demonstrate the learning which could occur through the observations and international cognitions and process without any reinforcement. So the key theory and contribution in this humanistic perspective is self-actualization and the person-centered approach, which was from Abraham Maslow in 1943, showed an hierarchy of need, positioning, and self-actualization, which is the realizations of one full potential and as the climate of human motivation. My next slide, it's my next slide is the Maslow hierarchy of need, which is self-actualization, morality, creativity, spontaneity, problem solving, lack of prejudice, and acceptance of fact. The next one is the self-esteem, confidence, achievement, respect of others, and respect to others. Love, belonging is the friendship, the family, and the intimacy. Safety is the security of body, employment, and resource of morality of the family and also the property. And then the psychology aspect of it is the breathing, the food, the water, the sex, the sleep, and the homeostasis, which is for time's sake, chapter 3 is the descriptions of psychological perspective. This was established by John Watson and B.F. Skinner, who shifted the ideology's focus from subjective mind and observable behavior. It posits that all the behavior is learned through the environmental interaction, emphasizes the measurable phenomenon for scientific inquiry, while disregarding international events like thoughts and emotions. A key learning of this mechanism is in perspective of classical conditioning, which amplified by Pavlov experience, where an natural stimuli like a bell become associated with stimuli like food, and also triggering the conditioning of response in salivation. My next one is the picture of the unconditional stimuli and the neutral stimuli, which is the no response and the conditional stimuli with the response. Moving into B.F. Skinner's apparent conditioning. This involved the learning through the consequence of behaviors, which is followed by reinforcement. He believed that a positive outcomes or reward are strengthened and more likely to be repeated. Behaviors are like followed by punishment, that's the negative outcome aspect of it, and the weakness are less likely to repeat. Skinner works are meticulously to show how reward powerfully shapes the behaviors. So the next one on my slide is the apparent conditioning, which is shown by a specific consequence which are associated by the voluntary behavior. The reward is introduced to increase a behavior, and the punishment is introduced to decrease the behavior, which the picture is shown. So description of this humanistic perspective emerging from 20th century, which is in the 1950s to 1960s. The humanistic perspective was a reaction to perceive the limitations of both behaviorism and psychoanalysis. The pioneer, which was Carl Roger and Ibrahim Mosri, they argue that the earlier perspective were demonizing behaviorism by reducing people to mere product of conditioning, and also psychoanalysis, which focus on the pathological instincts. But humanistic psychology instead emphasized free will, personal agency, and the innate human drive towards the growth and self-actualization. The key concepts of this perspective include the self-actualization, which is drive to reach one full potential. It actually emphasizes on ongoing growth and self-actualization, which was introduced by Carl Roger. The concept of concept, which consists of real self, who one is, and the ideal self, which is aspired by who is aspired to be. Okay, so the psychological well-being occur when there is a high degree of congruence between this unconditional positive regard and acceptance and support without conditions. In a contract, this conditional positive regards leads to psychological distress and incongruent, which is the obstructing personal growth and self acceptance. Okay, so the key assumption of this is a behavioral perspective. The primary assumption is that the only observable measurement behavior is valid data for psychology. Okay, so behavior is learned from experience, quote. So all the behavior from simple reflects to a complex personality. it's learned from environment. So that is the belief. And then through the interaction and experience, animals and humans learn in a similar way as quote. The fundamental assumptions of this classical and apparent conditioning is which universal. So the process is observed in a control experiment with animal of, for example, that of Pavlov, which is the experience behavior is strictly determined by the environment. That's determinism, and then proceeding environment stimuli or the history of reinforcement, which is there is no room for an autonomy. So assumption in humanistic perspective is that the human have a free will, an active agent which makes conscious choices, okay, so which also influence their own development, and also unconscious instincts are like puppets which control by the environment or unconscious instinct. The study of this object or subjective experiment is paramount, which is assumed that the only way that to understand a person is from their own subjection or subjective, which is conscious perception, meaning these feelings, thoughts, self perceptions, and personal meaning is most important data for psychology. People are inherently good and have an innate drive for growth. It assumes that the human nature is good, positive, and on their positive, and they help them achieve growth. This help them achieve growth, fulfillment, and self-actualization. The holistic approach is necessary because the whole human, which is being studied, is not broken down in isolation stimuli, which is the humanism, which is the stimuli, isolated stimuli, which humanism shows that you cannot study their whole. And then the next on my slide is evaluation of key theories, which is from B.F. Skinner in 1904 to 1990. Skinner was a radical behaviorist. He advanced the theory of apparent conditioning. His experience conduct the animal in a controlled environment of the Skinner box, and then demonstrate how behavior is systemically shaped by consequence of reward or punishment. So the next one on my slide is a box, which is the Skinner box, which highlighted the speaker, highlighted the signal, the lights, and food dispenser, which is the electric grid, and to shock the generator and all that. The picture is as shown, and then the next one on my time for time's sake is the strength of his work. The greatest contribution, which was on a scientific observations and behaviors, he made psychology to be in a clear and measurable, testable framework, which enhance the credible as a science form. And however, the practical application of this work helps in forming the basic behaviors, modifying technique, which is a clinical setting, in treating phobias, in education, example, token economy system and organization management. So the weakness of his work is criticized to be radical determination. It denied free will, viewing human behavior as a predictable product of their own environment. It simplified the complex of human experiment to a series of stimulus, response, and connection. It ignores the influence of cognitions like thought, expectation, biological predispositions like genetics, and all those hormonal states. That's Carl Rogers in my next one. The next one on my slide. Rogers, who pioneer, the next one is Carl Rogers, who pioneer psychotherapy which developed the humanistic approach known as person-centered therapy. The theory places an individual's subjective experience and inherent potential for growth and forefront. The strength of his work, which is Rogers, is celebrated for being holistic and optimistic. It views people as active agents in their own life, capable of positive growth and direction. This core condition of therapy is empathy, congruent, and unconditional regard, are now considered in many counseling and approaches. The weakness of his work is a main criticism, which is in his work, and that is a lack of scientific rigor, sometimes like self-actualizations and congruence, which abstract the difficult to define and measure the empirically. This leads to accusation that the perspective is more idealistic, which underestimate the powerful role of unconscious motive and societal structure and situational constraints that shapes the behavior. Okay, so the next on my slide is analysis of similarity and differences. These two perspectives, behaviorism and humanistic, both contribute to the treatment of mental conditioning and influence the human reaction to real life situation. The behavior perspective is rooted in scientific principles, which is focusing on the measurable and the observable behavior, which influence the environmental stimuli and reinforcement. In contrast to this, the humanistic perspective is more subjective and emphasizing personal experiences, free will, self-concept, and it highlights the importance of the international drive, which is the self-actualization and the need to positive regard, while the behaviorism look external focus as a key influencers of behavior, and humanism prioritize individual agencies and personal choices. The application of the treatment of anxiety and disorder behavior application in treating anxiety and exposure therapy is the next one on my list, which I'm going to slide down. A therapy called exposure therapy is standard treatment for phobia and post-traumatic stress disorder, which is direct application of classical conditioning. The therapy works by systematically, gradually exposing an individual to a fear stimulus in a safe control manner. A process of this is called instinction, which is a learn associate between the stimulus and fear stimulus in safe and control manners. A process of broken, meaning the fear is broken by this process. For example, a person with a door phobia would be gradually exposed to door, for instance, from maybe picture to being in the same room with a calm door. But the criticism over this is that it may not treat the cognition aspect of the belief and thoughts that cause the fear, which is showing in the picture from step 1, 2, 3. And the next one on my this thing is a continuity of the strength of exposure to the therapy. So the strength of this is highly effective for anxiety disorder, especially the phobia and the PTSD. Results can be quickly be measurable. The next one, it helps break the cycle of avoidance, which is anxiety. It teaches the brain that fear the situation are actually safe, okay? And it also has a strong research evidence and used widely in clinical practice. The limitation of the exposure therapy can feel emotionally intense. It can also be uncomfortable for clients. It can also, some people may drop out in fear of overwhelming, and then require motivational professional guideline and do it will require the motivational guideline to do correctly. It may also focus on the symptoms more than underlying emotions and causes, not always suitable for very fragile or highly traumatized clients without adaptation. Okay, humanistic application of treating anxiety disorder. This is the person-centered therapy. Person-centered therapy is used to treat anxiety disorder for fostering an empathic and genuine and non-judgmental environments. The therapists assist the client. This is where the therapists will assist the client in exploring their anxiety, promoting self-discovery, and addressing congruence between their real self, which experience fear, and their ideal self, which believe that they shouldn't feel fear. The primary goal of this PTC is to empower clients to identify their own solution and cultivate that self-acceptance and ultimately helping them to manage their anxiety and more effectively. However, the strength of the work person-centered therapy is to create a warm, accepting, and non-judgmental space for the client and to build self-esteem, which is self-awareness and emotional growth. It helps clients to feel truly heard and understand. It also encourages long-term personal changes, not just a symptom relief. It strengthens the therapeutic relationship between the improved healing. So the limitation of this work person-centered therapy is less structured because it may feel unfocused for some clients. It doesn't teach specific coping skill or anxiety reductions and technique. Progress can be slow. It depends on a client insight and motivation. May be encouraged on its own for self-anxiety and panic disorder. Those are the weakness of the work. So the next on my slide is my conclusion, which is the behavior and humanistic perspective. I like to conclude by saying the behavior realized in science method observed measures and behavior. Humanism emphasizes on personal, agent, and subjective experiences, promoting holistic view of individual. Each perspective have their own strength and weakness, yet both are valuable. Is treating anxiety disorder. The principle of this behaviorism and the humanism continue to play a very significant role in modern psychological and practice, highlighting their own important understanding and addressing behavior experience. The next one is my reference, which I would like to end. All have been listed. Thank you so much for